Thank you, Father. Thank you, fathers, for having me here today. I'm fighting a little low back pain, so I appreciate your indulgence of having me on a stool. This is the best move for me. And I'm going to do my best. The 25 to 35 minute thing, pray for me that I do well on that count. So in my correspondence with Father Pierre, he said there's 3 sessions. And so what I proposed is that we look at first cultural consideration. So that will be our first talk. Where does this come from? It doesn't come from nowhere. Second, moral and theological considerations. What does the church teach? And lastly, pastoral considerations, caring for families and individuals. Any one of those could be a full day or week. I've had to choose, some small segment to address in the 30 minutes or so, and then your questions can direct us to, other things that would have been good for me to have covered, but that are quite tailor-made for your questions and concerns. So the first talk, cultural considerations. Where did this come from? Whenever you have a sort of a radical shift, and in our particular context, I would say the most obvious expression of a radical shift is dramatically increasing numbers of young people not identifying with their biological sex. I mean, just off the charts growth in that in the last 10 years or so. There has to be something going on culturally to make sense of that. And so what I propose for us, and by the way, this is all leading up to pastoral concerns. They're not a tag on at the end. My conviction is you can't do that well if you haven't done this other foundational work first. If you haven't thought about what's going on in the culture and what the church teaches, which are the first 2 talks, then you're not well prepared to do the pastoral care. This is not an exhaustive list. There's I'm sure lots more that can be said, and we can discuss it in Q&A. But I have 4 large-ish categories for our consideration. The first one is contemporary anthropology. How our society thinks about and talks about the human person. I got off the airplane in Edmonton a few years ago, and on the jet bridge, there was, a 30-foot long advertisement, along the jet bridge. And it was for a cosmetics company. And it said, "You are what you make up." Right? So clever pun for a cosmetics company, right? Makeup. But it speaks to something very deep in terms of what our young people experience in terms of where they are supposed to find their identity. So historically, for virtually every culture in human history, you figure out your identity in your family, in your community, in relationship with your body, your work. I recently listened to a Catholic psychologist on a podcast who said, at the very basic level, we figure out our identity by physically encountering the world around us, and that's being radically limited because so much of our young people's experience is mediated through a screen, which makes the world 2-dimensional. It makes identity formation incredibly difficult. And so things that previous generations of young people did to figure out who they were and where they belonged in the world have been sort of cut off at the roots. In fact, we have language that makes it sound like if you believe or feel or understand something about yourself because of your religion, because of your family of origin, because of where you came from, any of these kinds of things, which are the standard places where people have sorted out their identity, that is somehow inauthentic. If you can explain it by some external category, it's almost by that very fact disqualified. The only thing that matters is the authentic interior feeling. And where does that come from? Well, we don't know. But if we can identify any particular thing leading to it, then it's not the real authentic me, right? So there's some vague sense of an authentic self that creates itself ex nihilo. It's from nothing, because if you can identify it with anything, it's by that very fact inauthentic. And the idea that we must be more than anything else is authentic, right? This puts young people in a terrible bind, because there actually is no interior self that's unrelated to our experience, our heritage, our families, our body. Like, to divorce yourself from all of the roots of identity is to be free-floating nowhere, and to leave yourself completely open to all kinds of suggestions that imagine that they're your authentic self. But of course, as soon as you find out that those things came from somewhere, well, they're inadequate too. So it's quicksand. You're creating yourself on quicksand, and you can't escape. And so our young people have been told, for example, you get to make your own meaning. There is no inherent meaning in life, but congratulations, you are the first generation that is free enough. You get to create your own meaning. The flip side of getting to create your own meaning is that you have to create your own meaning. And that's putting a burden on people and not lifting a finger to help. You cannot create your own meaning, not in any way that will satisfy, because you know you just made it up, and you know you might have chosen differently. And your heart cannot rest in something so arbitrary. You remember how Pope Francis talked about how the church is unhealthy if it's self-referential, right? We're demanding that young people be nothing but self-referential. You can't make sense of yourself in the world with yourself as the only referent. There has to be things outside yourself. So that's one, contemporary anthropology. A second thing, the logic of progress. I don't know if you remember, the morning after the Supreme Court in the United States decided Obergefell, so that's the case that legalized same-sex marriage in the United States. There was a cartoon that I saw on my Facebook feed from George Takei. I was talking to a Trekkie here earlier. So George Takei was Sulu in the original Star Trek, and now he was a pretty prominent. I don't know if he would call himself an activist, but a gay public figure who was quite prominent on social media. And he shared an image that the morning after Obergefell, and it was him sitting at a computer, or a person sitting at a computer, and out of the computer screen was shooting rainbows. And if you remember the morning after Obergefell, social media was absolutely full with, this battle has been won. The battle for same-sex marriage has been won. The next battle is the battle for trans rights. It was declared immediately. And the idea is that progress always needs some victim class to be vindicated next. And so the trans rights issue was designated immediately after Obergefell. We've got the momentum, we have to go. And it was seen as the logical next step. Now, you may have encountered in the last couple of years, there's some fracturing in what is often called the LGBTQ plus community. There is a group that will say LGB without the T. They'll say things like, we didn't sign up for this. We signed up for rights for us to marry or have equal treatment in terms of things like inheritances or healthcare or, various things that might be related to marriage in a legal sense. We did not sign up for chemical castration of children or various things like that. So there's some, in fact, CBC French ran an article in Quebec about how the gay community, this is some years ago, was really worried that gender ideology was taking young men who would grow up to be gay and having them identify as something other than male at a very young age, and so was eradicating gay men by having these young boys identify as women. This is, in fact, historically, this is how some Muslim cultures have dealt with homosexuality. So they say, well, actually, you're a woman, and you live as a woman, and then even though you're biologically a man, you're not gay, right? So there's this internal tension and we could it shows up in a bunch of different ways. One important way is the loss of tomboys. right? So we all grew up with tomboys, girls who played with the boys, who cut their hair short, who dressed androgynously, let's say, and lots of those girls who grew up to be happy, healthy women with short hair. I mean, who cares, are being sort of co-opted and being told, well, if you're good at sports, or if you want short hair, or you don't want to wear a dress, then you mustn't actually be a girl, right? So the logic of progress jumped on this and said, we need, regardless of internal consistency, we need an issue to keep the momentum going, which is one way you capture young people's allegiance, because they're idealistic. They want to be on the right side of history. So you say, well, this is the next step in civil rights. Okay, so that's another one. A third one, I have no way of proving this. My gut tells me that this is the single most important one, at least the most proximate issue. The influence of technology, smartphones and social media. All you have to do is look at a graph between introduction of smartphone and smartphone use and identification as something other than your biological sex, and they track almost exactly parallel. They start going up in 2014, and it's when young people get phones with social media. So I think there's a couple things going on here. One is the content of the social media itself, right? So Facebook starts giving you various options to identify as, at one point it was up to 57 different gender options, and then I think it just became open-ended. YouTube, we've all seen how the YouTube algorithm works, right? We know about the rabbit hole. So if you click on something that looks a little interesting, and then 2 clicks later, there's someone denying the Holocaust, and you're like, how did this happen, right? So if you go on YouTube and you want to know what your gender is, which is a not uncommon, a kid goes to school in grade 2, they find out there's lots of different genders, and your gender isn't necessarily your sex, and it's your job to figure out what your gender actually is, and you go home and you ask YouTube. If you want to run an experiment, just try pretending you're an 11-year-old asking YouTube what your gender is. It's terrifying. So I did this for experimental purposes once. I looked this up. I found this lovely, this very kid-friendly cartoon describing if you feel this way or that way, then you're like this, and you can have this label. There's 2 fascinating things, the comments and the advertisements. The comments, one set of comments said, "Thank you so much, I finally know who I am." The other set of comments said, "This isn't accurate. If what you described as category X is in fact category Y, and you need to straighten this out." And then there was a fight in the comments between people who said, "I finally understand myself because this video gave me language and a category for my gender." And another group of people saying, "That's not quite accurate. You need different categories." Now, you may have noticed that the categories are always shifting. One of the reasons that they're always shifting is they're by definition almost fluid, because they're trying to capture every nuance of human experience, which is a shifting reality and which varies quite wildly between one person and another. And so the logical outcome is there will be roughly 8 billion gender identities, because they will speak to every particular individual's experience of their sexed body. Or you could say there's 2 and there's a really healthy broad range within the 2. I mean, those are the 2 logical options. You can have 2, but a really wide range within the 2, and even in fact some overlap. Or you can have 8 billion, but 57 isn't going to work. Like 57 cannot, by definition, be the right answer, right? So that's the comments. The other thing was the advertisements, and you can't reproduce this because the advertisements will be different every time. But the first time I saw this video, the ad was it was terrifying. Do you remember the Blair Witch Project? That really creepy movie with like the shaky camera, kids running through the woods and whatever. So the cinematic style was Blair Witch Project, but the imagery was young women in the bathroom. on the toilet. And the ad was to teach young women who understood themselves to be too fat a special technique for defecating that would help them lose weight. Now, why does the algorithm give us that ad for a video for 11-year-olds asking what their gender is? Because it knows darn well that this, we're not allowed to say this out loud, but the algorithm doesn't care. It knows darn well that we are feeding on people's body issues, right? And so it knows that people coming here have anxieties about their bodies, and maybe it can sell them some hoax way to defecate to lose weight, right? So it's extremely predatory. Now, the people who made the video, I want to be clear, the people who made the video did not decide on that ad, right? I'm not saying anything about their intentions, but the algorithm knows what's happening, right? It can track all the patterns. So on the one hand, social media, its content invites young people into thinking in this way about themselves and their relationships with their bodies. We could walk through a whole series of different social media platforms. There was a piece on CBC a while ago about Instagram. This was heartrending. It was, on Instagram, you can put filters, right? So you take pictures of yourself and then you filter your image so you don't look like yourself. Then when you look in the mirror and you don't look like your filter, you induce a kind of body dysmorphia. I don't feel at home in my body because I don't look like my filter. What's the solution to body dysmorphia? Surgery. So the story on CBC was of young women getting surgery to look like their Instagram filters. And the most heartrending scene in the whole thing was a young woman, East Indian woman, with a rather ethnically particular East Indian nose, next to her mother, who, and they said it out loud in the video, who had given her that nose, and she got rid of her nose with the Instagram filter, right? So now she was going to get surgery so that she didn't have her mother's nose, right? It was completely heart-wrenching, right? But so that's just Instagram. You could walk down the line. Tinder, the dating app, the experience of men on Tinder is a constant stream of rejection by women. The experience of women on Tinder is the constant experience of creepy strangers, right? So that's how you understand your relationship with the opposite sex, if it's largely mediated through Tinder. And so you get something, has anyone heard of transmaxing? So transmaxing is men who say we can't get women, but we like physical interactions with women's bodies. How about if some of us get women's bodies and then we can have experiences with one another? Right? And there was a manifesto, it's called Transmaxing. This is speculation, so don't take this and run with it, but it's at least possible that that's part of what was going on. Charlie Kirk's shooter was a male who was living with a male romantically connected who was transitioning to female, right? So all of this is mediated through different social media platforms that all have their own logic, all of which is completely disorienting to a young person trying to figure out their relationship with their body. Just completely disorienting. And the last point I will make about this is the content of the social media is only part of the situation. The fact that it is that you experience most of your life through a phone, which is two-dimensional, I think is also fundamental to the problem. You don't actually experience your life and your relationships through your sexed body. You experience your life and your relationships through a screen, right? So the possibility for integration with your body is drastically cut off by the fact that your social, your romantic, your emotional life is not, from your own experience, an embodied experience. It's a mediated experience, right? So parents who have children my age are in a very strange situation relative to parents of a previous generation. If you have kids who are in their teens, right, like I have, and you like catch them making out on the couch, you're like, good. I'm glad that you're experiencing your body and another person's body, because you need that to figure out who you are in the world. I play in a cover band, and we'll go play a bar, and there's no one under 45 who dances in a bar anymore, right? So to give your young people an experience of their bodies, okay, young people are having sex much less than they did in previous generations. You think that's good, right? We're winning for chastity. No, we're losing for human contact. They don't engage with other people. You can't have sex with someone, well, you can simulate it, on your phone by yourself, right? Now, I'm not saying we should encourage them all to, rush off and do imprudent and unchaste things, but you see the difference, right? Thinking ahead to pastoral considerations, you've probably experienced this. The families and the young people coming to you with these issues are very often, I would say almost exclusive. I would be surprised if it's not exclusively people who are in over their heads on social media. I mean, just and I should mention Reddit. One of the single largest predictors of identifying as something other than your biological sex is participation in certain communities on Reddit. And so in our own circles, good Catholic families, the families who struggle with this the most are the families who've had the least success in having healthy boundaries with their kids on social media. And I would be very surprised to hear about examples that are not related to that. Right? So that would be one of the first questions if a family comes to you about their son or daughter. I would say let's explore the social media environment they live in. That's probably, in most cases, the single largest factor. And the last one. Sorry, Father, you can go back. The last one, poisoned categories. Young people today have grown up with porn in a way that, you remember, you had to steal a Playboy from your friend's dad and run off in the woods and, such an innocent time. I remember a guy who had one under a footbridge out in the bush, and everyone knew that Jordan Huska had a Playboy, under this bridge, right? Can you imagine the innocence of that? And now, no, what happens when your exposure to human sexuality is mediated through the categories of pornography from the time you're 11, right? Well, men are brutes and women are sluts. So which one do you want to be? Right? And layer Me Too onto that, right? So Me Too happens in this, as everyone's getting their phones and coming to figure out who they are in their bodies. And Me Too says that men are perpetrators and women are victims. Which one do you want to be? Now, I'm not saying there's nothing good behind the motivation of Me Too. I'm not trying to slant. Obviously, there were good things that needed to be said out loud. But I'm talking about the experience of a young person who's growing up when those are the media stories that are happening, right? Between porn and Me Too, the images you have of men and of women are completely distorted. The idea, the possibility of a healthy masculinity or a healthy femininity is hard to even imagine. We know about toxic masculinity. I don't know, have our young men ever heard of healthy masculinity? Or is masculinity toxic by definition? Right? I have teenage boys, and they don't go in for, these guys. You've maybe heard of Andrew Tate, the pornographer and human trafficker, who gets a lot of, following among young men. And my boys don't go in for that, but they understand why some people do, because Andrew Tate says to young men, be a man. It's not bad to be a man. Now, the image he portrays of masculinity is not what I want for my sons, and certainly not what I want for my daughter's future husbands. But when the mainstream of society tells you that there is no good way to be a man, and Andrew Tate says, come follow me, you've got something. Because no one wants to live thinking that I can't ever be good because I'm a man, right? And on the women's side, very common experience for women who don't want to identify as women is experiences of pornography or abuse. So you will encounter people coming to you, two different experiences in my own circle. Families who have a teenage daughter who doesn't want to be a girl, who's being encouraged by the educational and medical establishments to transition. Yes, you've found your true self, all this kind of stuff. In one case, and this is a hard pastoral case, in one case, one parent is on board with this way of proceeding and one parent has questions. And this is an incredibly difficult situation. But what they find out after the process has begun is that the girl has been the victim of sexual abuse. And the establishment that wants to rush her to affirm her in her new identity is not interested in hearing about that abuse, because that, remember the first category, you are what you make up, that is a condition that is rooted in history and the world and the body and is therefore inauthentic and disqualifying for understanding identity, which must only come from the interior felt sense. And so they have to sweep the history of abuse under the rug. But we know, even before this, and we'll get to this in the third, briefly in the third talk, historically, women who don't identify as women, or if that category wasn't widely available, who just stopped associating with men and entered a lesbian relationship, sometimes not even a sexual one, sometimes just a life partnership with a woman that's not sexual, were very often victims of abuse, or had witnessed their mother. A young girl who witnesses her mother being abused by a man grows up and says, that will never happen to me, and so I won't be in a relationship with a man, or I will become a man, and then I will be protected from that experience, right? So if you grow up where healthy masculinity and healthy femininity are not even conceptually possible, what you end up with, this is very interesting. The most common thing is not young men identifying as women or young women identifying as men. The single largest category is young men or women identifying as neither. To identify as non-binary is more common than identifying as cross-sex. If you identify as non-binary, you can just opt out of the whole sorry mess. This isn't, right? And asexuality is a really interesting one, right? On the one hand, you're like, oh, well, you're asexual. Good. You won't make any dumb decisions in the next 5 years, right? But in fact, it's a retreat from a certain aspect of your humanity because that is scary, right? There's something out there that's dangerous that you've seen in the world that you're not going to be a part of. Right, so Jazz Jennings, you know the story. Jazz was My Name is Jazz, or I'm Jazz, the reality show about this trans kid. And there's any number of harrowing scenes, but one of them is when the kid is going through surgeries that will render orgasm impossible later in life. They just like, well, I just understand it's like an involuntary reflex, like a sneeze. Like I can live without that, right? So like they're just opting out of sexuality, right? And it's not like fertility, right? So the possibility of children in the future, a lot, and we can talk when we get to the second one. We talk about transitioning, various things that can happen, will render you infertile or sexually dysfunctional. And people are like, yeah, I'll take that trade. You're like, can you imagine growing up? None of us growing up, I think, would have taken that trade. When I was growing up, if you said you'll never have children or you'll never have an orgasm, we'd be like, get away from me, right? And now young people today are like, sounds good. right? That's only possible if marriage, family, sexuality, masculinity, femininity are all poison categories, that you don't want any of that, right? Okay, so those are 4 pretty broad categories. There's lots of other things I'm sure we could talk about, but I hope they're helpful for understanding the culture in which young people are trying to figure out who they are, the perennial task of the young person to find their identity in their teen years has been immensely complicated by this situation. And a lot of that is what's going to show up for us in pastoral care settings and cultural conversations around this kind of thing. And I think it's worth at least considering what's in the background. Every person, of course, has their own story. You don't take these categories and then override somebody's individual history, right? But granted that everyone has their own story, I think it's worth knowing in the background, because when we get to pastoral care, one of the things we're going to talk about is just like asking some good questions. Not in a condemning way, but just in a sort of Socratic, like, well, what about this? What about that? And having some of this in the background can be really helpful for how we navigate some of that. So that's talk number 1. Thanks for hanging out with me for that. And we'll move to questions in a minute.